what do they call it? BFF? Isn't that what the kids call it? He and I met, I will tell you real quickly, most of the stuff we are going to talk about Larry will be his service background with Air America and the Marine Corps. But I feel I need to give a personal touch to this. We met in 1954 on 7th Street, just south of Argonne Avenue, walking to Grady High School together. And he's become my best friend. We hit it off right away. I will tell you that most of the things he and I were involved in high school and college, the statute of limitations has run. And I will also tell you that I'm his lawyer, so that requires me to withhold a great deal of information because of the attorney-client privilege. But he and I have been through a lot of stuff together, and among the things that I wanted to mention to you is I served 8 years active duty and then another 16 years in the National Guard, a little bit in the reserves mixed in there somewhere. And every single military installation, and I'm including Vietnam, Germany, Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, Fort Sill, Fort Benning, I don't know that I was ever in a military installation that at some point Larry Taylor did not show up. Including Vietnam. Now, if you want to know his overall judgment, he was the only former service person, or he's a Marine, so they're never former, they're always current. But he was the only Marine who took a vacation in Vietnam during the 1968 Tet Offensive, which sort of worries me, because if he did that, and they gave him 2 stars, do we have to say anything more about the Marine Corps at that point? He is my best friend. I want to tell you something. He is a man of the highest integrity, and I mean that sincerely. He was always, we were 3 months apart in age, but he was always a mentor to me. He actually, when we were in the 9th grade, I guess he was in the 10th and I was in the 9th, we were walking to school and he hands me a couple of books, one of which was Aristotle on ethics. Now, I'm not going to say that wouldn't have been my normal book to read, but I would say that at that time the Playboy, a monthly edition, and probably the Sears catalog were the 2 things I valued the most. But he took this dumbass that lived on 7th Street and could barely get to Grady High School and I hope made something out of me. He's an incredible warrior. He has got an incredible history, and let me tell you a little bit about that. First of all, he is a Major General. He is the possessor of the Legion of Merit, the Navy Distinguished Service Medal, and the Air Medal. He wouldn't allow me to tell you the other decorations that he has, but that, I think, says it all, those 3 decorations. He was born in New York City in March of 1941. They moved to Atlanta when he was 5 or 6 years old.
Terry, can you speak into the microphone, please?
Oh, you can't hear me? Am I? I'm sorry. I will do that. I assume with my loud voice, people can you hear me, Ed? Okay. He served in the following positions during his 38-year plus career as a Major General in the Marine Corps. He was commissioned in 62. He went to flight school 62 and 63. And then was assigned to an H-34 squadron in 64 and 65, and later an infantry battalion doing his ground duty. His primary units that he served with were Marine, sorry, I'm going to have to get over here. Is that better? All right. It's the Marine Attack Helicopter Squadron, which he commanded 773. He commanded them in 80 to 82. The 4th Air Naval Gunfire Liaison Company from 82 to 84. he was the commanding general of the 2nd Marine Expeditionary, but you can tell I was in the Army, Expeditionary Brigade, and was the commander of the 4th Marine Air Wing. He has the 3 highest awards you can receive, and is a member of GENSA, National Organization of Retired Field and Flag Officers, where he serves on the Board of Advisors. He's on the Board of Advisors of the USO, of the Callahan Fund at Georgia Tech, and is the recipient of the Georgia Tech Distinguished Alumni Award last year, and I had the pleasure of attending with him. He is my friend. He has supported me through whatever things are going on in my life, and I hope I've been good enough to do the same. He is, please welcome, a man of high integrity and a guy who deserves to be a 2-star, Larry S. Taylor.
Well, I'm a little nervous. You know, I can talk to Rotary or whatever, and I can tell them anything, and they'll believe it. I don't think I can BS this crowd. Next slide. Let's see what the next slide says. Yeah. Okay, next one. Okay. Yeah, tighten that thing. Yeah, thanks a lot. Okay, how did Air America begin? The last time I gave this presentation, it was to the Vietnam Helicopter Pilots Association, and I think I omitted this part, the corporate lineage of Air America, which goes all the way back to the Flying Tigers in World War II. The American Volunteer Group, as you know, were civilians flying P-40 Warhawks for the Chinese Nationalist Air Force, actually, against the Japanese before we entered the war in Pearl Harbor. Then Pearl Harbor happened, the U.S. enters the war, the Flying Tigers are folded back into the Army Air Forces. Claire Chennault, the founder of the Flying Tigers, became an Air Force general. The war ends. Claire Chennault remains in Asia and starts an outfit called Civil Air Transport, which became, in 1949, when the nationalists lost the war to the Chinese communists and wound up migrating to the island of Formosa, now known as Taiwan. Civil Air Transport, Claire Chennault's outfit, became the first flag carrier of Taiwan. Somewhere around 1950 or thereabouts, CAT, the Civil Air Transport, was bought by CIA, and that began the history of CIA operations with respect to this particular outfit. That began as strictly a commercial airline, as I said, the flag carrier for Taiwan. But then the French started fighting against the communists in Indochina, and it was decided that we needed to help them. They didn't have everything they needed there, and we began to fly in support, logistic support of the French in Indochina. And as a matter of fact, the first 2 casualties that Air America ever suffered, or Civil Air Transport, I should say, the ones they ever suffered were 2 guys that were shot down and killed while supporting the French in the famous battle at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. Let's fast forward now to 1960 or thereabouts, during the Kennedy administration, when there was a Laos crisis, and it was decided that not only did we need a little logistic support, but they needed some helicopter support too. I said 60, I think it was 62 actually, when the Kennedy administration sent a squadron of Marine helicopters to northern Thailand at the base called Udon, which you can see just south of Vientiane up there on the map, was where the Royal Thai Air Force Base was at Udon. And they created a helicopter program there out by using the helicopters and the pilots from those Marines that were deployed. They gave the pilots the option when they decided that they wanted to end the deployment and send the Marines back home. They said to the pilots, we're going to leave these aircraft here, and you can either go back in the Marine Corps, your deployment is over, and you'll now go wherever the Marine Corps sends you, or you can leave the Marine Corps, become a civilian, and become a pilot for Air America. And that's how the Air America helicopter program started in the early 60s. How did it begin for me? Well, it began, actually, the seed was planted by a guy, some of you may know, if you're especially the Army helicopter guys, a warrant officer named Norm Grammer. Anybody remember Norm Grammer? Goes way back. Yeah. He was serving in Germany with King at the time, and he started talking to me one time over a beer or two when I was visiting King there about this mysterious outfit that he had heard about, and he was thinking about going to work for him when he left active duty in the Army. And that planted the seed in my head. And in the spring of 1966, I wrote him a letter expressing interest. And they wrote me back and said, don't call us, we'll call you. Along about September of '66, which was my last year of obligated active duty at the time, I was due out in December. They sent me a telegram. Remember those telegrams? They sent me a telegram and said, if you're still interested, come on up to D.C. and interview. And I did. At the time, I was current not only in the H-34, but I was also current in a couple of fixed-wing aircraft, C-45, the old twin Beech, a Beech 18, and also the T-28, which I had trained in the training command in flight school, and remained current during the time I was on active duty. And so I heard there had been a T-20, it was a T-28 program, and I told the guy that interviewed me that I want to fly T-28s. And he said, quote, we have no T-28s. Well, if you look at the handout that's on each of the tables out there, you'll see a picture of something that I saw when I first arrived at Udorn when I was a new hire in January of '67. The first thing I saw was a half a dozen T-28s on the flight line of Air America at Udorn. Now, I have never known to this day whether Red Dawson, the guy that interviewed me, I've never known whether he was lying to me or it was such a highly classified program that he may not have known himself back in Washington that there was, in fact, a T-28 program. And you can imagine that this was even more highly classified than everything else because you're talking about civilian pilots flying armed T-28s, twin 50s mounted under each wing, and small 250-pound bombs in a neutral country. Now, that was even more classified than everything else we were doing. Now, most of our reunions, we still have a reunion every year. Most of them, frankly, are just drink-a-thons. But in 2019, it was special and probably the best reunion we ever had because the previous year, thousands and thousands of documents had been declassified by that time, at that time. And that led to this symposium that we had at a 3-hour symposium at the National Press Club in Washington entitled Air America Declassified, and I think there's a handout on each of the tables out there that summarizes some of what we talked about back then. And that was absolutely fascinating. When I heard about this, I thought we were going to hear about operational stuff, which would have interested me the most, and we did hear some of that, but the most interesting stuff was totally a surprise to me, and if you thumb through that handout, you'll discover transcripts of conversations about us in the White House between Nixon, Kissinger, LBJ, Schlesinger, William Colby, the head of the CIA, and it it boggled the mind to think, and I certainly had never occurred to me at the time when I was there back in 67, 68, that the president and the director of the CIA and the national security advisor would be sitting in the White House talking about us. But they were, and some of those transcripts I think that you'll find in there are fascinating. Yes, it was all classified, but it really wasn't much of a secret. It was referred to as covert, but it was about as overt as covert can be. Everybody over there in Southeast Asia had a pretty decent idea of what we were doing. Certainly the American military did. The enemy certainly knew. American civilians working in Southeast Asia knew. The only people really that didn't know were the American civilians back home. Excuse me. And that wasn't because it was a secret so much. I remember reading an article while I was over there in Time magazine about Air America. It wasn't much of a secret at all. It's just that people weren't paying attention. Back then, they'd rather watch I Love Lucy, right, than think about the war or read about the war. Kind of sounds familiar, doesn't it? Except now it's watching American Idol instead of worrying about things like war and peace. I got there in January of '67, as I said. Spent a couple of months flying an area familiarization with one of the pilots that had been there for quite some time. Checked out as a captain in the H-34. We usually flew, unlike the military, we usually flew single pilot, single aircraft. As you know, in the Marine Corps and the Army and the other services, you always have two pilots in a two-pilot aircraft. And you're usually or frequently flying in section or division or even larger formations. And we didn't do that when we were flying routinely. It was single plane, single pilot. Typical schedule was we'd leave Udorn and fly up into Laos about 6 days, typically. Come back to Udorn for a day or two, then go back up for a few more days, back and forth all month long. The months, I'm sure many of you guys similarly had long hours months. 100-hour months were not uncommon. I can remember having a couple of 70-hour weeks toward the end of '67 and early in '68 when it was getting the most intense, not only in Vietnam but in Laos as well. Sometimes you would come back to Udorn and have more than just a day or two off because of the way we were paid. We were paid by the hour, like an airline pilot. And obviously there was a need to relatively balance the flight time among all the pilots so that one guy wasn't making a hell of a lot more money than the others. We'll talk about how we were paid a little bit more in a minute. But three main customers. We referred to them as customers. The first and most routine was USAID, the foreign aid agency, much in the news recently. And with USAID, when you were flying for them, it was mainly rice and refugees. That was the least dangerous, the most demanding thing about flying for USAID was the terrain and the weather. Laos, as you probably know, is very, very rugged, much more so than Vietnam, and quite a bit higher elevation-wise than Vietnam. So the weather was a challenge, and flying those helicopters at those elevations was quite a challenge. Some of the pads were as high as 6,000, 6,500 feet, as I recall. And even in the plain of Jars, a relatively flat area, it was still over 3,000 feet elevation. That was the first customer was USAID. Then we had we worked for the second customer, which was the air attaché at the embassy in Vientiane. And when you were working for the air attaché, you were typically flying for the Royal Lao Army or the Hmong guerrilla forces in northern Laos. That was somewhat more hairy. troops, supplies, ammunition, medevacs, similar to what we all know helicopters do and were doing in Vietnam in those days, and also rice and refugees as well. The most, and as I said earlier, when we were flying these missions that I mentioned with USAID or the air attaché, it was typically single plane, single pilot. The most interesting was when you were told at the end of the day to work for 713. Now, 713, as I understood it at the time, were the last 3 digits of a contract number, and that contract was what enabled us to go to the middle of nowhere, somewhere in even more remote in Laos than Laos was in general, and work for a CIA guy in the middle of nowhere. Those were the most dangerous missions. Those were the ones that were mainly involved on or near the Ho Chi Minh Trail or the Sihanouk Trail. Let's go to the next slide, Skip, could we? Now, everybody's familiar with the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and that's a graphic. But one thing that the graphic does not show is right about the point where it shows Ho Chi Minh Trail and a little arrow coming out of Cambodia. Right about at that point where the border was where the Sihanouk Trail left Cambodia and entered Vietnam, entered Laos that way, and then on eastward into and joined up with the Ho Chi Minh Trail. I mention that because the only time I got hit over there was when I was running a mission on the Sihanouk Trail, and it was one of those missions for 713. Those of you that bought the book, I'm Ready to Talk, that particular incident when my aircraft got hit is what I discuss in that book, I'm Ready to Talk 1. So 713 were the ones that were the most interesting and the most dangerous, and we always flew with 2 pilots for when we were working for these guys, and usually with overhead cover. A1s typically from a place like Nakhon Phanom or Pleiku, or I remember one when we had VNAF A37s. Whatever was available, that's what we had.
Pointer.
Okay, good, thank you. So I mentioned the 3 customers, USAID, the air attaché, CIA, and then of course there were the occasional pop-up customers, like a guy gets shot down and we had to go do an SAR. We did a lot of those. As I said, those special missions were multi-pilot, multi-aircraft typically. I can remember being in that time that I got hit was in a gaggle of 7 helicopters, as I recall. 4 Air America H-34s and 3 CH-3 Air Force Special Operations helicopters, call sign Pony Express. Maybe some of you might have worked with them from time to time. How did we get paid? There was a small base pay. Then we had project pay. I mentioned earlier that we got paid by the hour. That was the amount of time that you spent below a certain altitude and over a certain area, which was almost entirely in Laos. And you got, I can't remember the exact number, but you got so much per hour for the time that you were in those areas. And then we got what was called special mission pay when we were working at or near the Ho Chi Minh Trail or running one of those missions for CIA. And that was the most interesting at all because it was cash. Yes, and that was always amazing. You'd run a certain number of these special missions during the month, and it was, if I remember the numbers correctly, it was $50 per mission or per hour, whichever was greater. Now remember, this is 1967, 1968, so you can imagine what $50 then is worth now. Bottom line, it was more discretionary income than I've ever had before or since. But cash on the barrelhead. Never appeared on the W-2. I remember each month you'd go up to the chief pilot's office and he'd hand you an envelope with greenbacks in it, and he'd say, "Now this is just between you and I." I said, "Yes, sir," and then I'd go over to the club and somebody would say, "Well, how many special mentions did you get this month?" We called them green stamps. "How many green stamps did you get this month?" And he'd say, "Well, I got 6," and I go, "Well, I only got 4, you know." But that was a real interesting way to get paid, I thought. The rest of it was, direct deposit, just like you normally would these days. There was always a rumor, too, I might add, that, and it bothered us because some of the Air Force guys thought that we got special pay for making SARs, and that was never true. Once upon a time, they told us to log SARs separately just in case that ever happened, but we never got any extra money for SARs, and anybody that were involved, yes, we were called mercenary, but the bottom line is when an American was in trouble, whether he was Air America or Air Force or whatever, we would go get him. And as a matter of fact, in the early days of the Jolly Greens, in those days, most of the SARs from the seaside, from the Gulf of Tonkin, were being conducted by the Navy. But from the land side, the Jolly Greens had just arrived, and were there not much longer not much earlier than the time that I was there. And most of the SARs when I was there were being conducted by Air America. The Jolly Greens were really good. They were courageous. They would go with very little regard for enemy action, but they weren't nearly as familiar with the area as our guys were. We had guys that had been there ever since 1962, as I mentioned, and were still there when I left. Some stayed as long as 15 years, right up until the evacuation of Saigon in 1975. So they knew the area really well. And of course, very highly experienced helicopter pilots in extremely demanding terrain and weather. I only got involved in one actual pickup. SAR of Firefly 1-5. Firefly 1-5 was an A-1, a Skyraider pilot who was shot down over a town called Samnua in extreme northeastern Laos. If you see up there where it says Plain of Jars, maybe halfway between that little red circle for Plain of Jars and the Chinese and the North Vietnamese border, that was where Samnua was, and that was the headquarters of the Pathet Lao, the communist forces in Laos. Well, he was dropping bombs up there and got shot down. He radioed, and we were all working the same frequency in those days. He radioed his radial and DME off of a TACAN site. Now, we didn't have TACAN in our aircraft, but I could see the site. The site was located on the top of a very rugged and infamous karst called Site 85, and a little bit more about Site 85 later. But when he radioed that he was punching out, he gave a radial and DME off of that TACAN site, and I looked at where I was, and I said, well, that's right about where I am. So you can imagine what was going through his mind when he decides to punch out of his aircraft. He thinks he's going to wind up in the Hanoi Hilton, and he pops out of the clouds, and there's a helicopter right there. As a matter of fact, there was another guy in the area as well. He wasn't even on the ground. I've heard him tell the story. He said he was on the ground 5 minutes. I don't even think it was 90 seconds. I orbited him on the way down. When he popped out of the clouds, he was so directly above me that I thought that he was going to descend into my tip path plane there for a minute. But like I said, he wasn't even on the ground 90 seconds, maybe 2 minutes, and we got him out of there. There were a couple of SARs that I was called in to do because I happened to be the closest, but that's the only actual pickup that I ever got involved in. Interesting tidbit about that, too. all I ever knew about the guy was his call sign, Firefly 15. Now, fast forward 30 some odd years, and there's a annual reunion at Kirtland Air Force Base of the Combat SAR Association. Maybe some of you have been there to talk about the missions, the SARs that you've been involved in, all wars starting in Vietnam. Well, I went there and told this story, and at the end of the story, a guy comes up to me out of the audience and says, I think I know that guy. I think Firefly 15 was a guy named Paul Kimenow, and he gave me his email address. Now, Paul Kimenow, I still never met the guy face to face, but we did communicate a little bit on email, which was gratifying to be able to actually link up with Firefly 15, whose name I never knew until that time. I mentioned earlier the only mission that my aircraft got hit on the Sihanouk Trail. One other fascinating event that happened, and to this day many people think that this is so off the wall and so unusual, they still think that it never happened and that somebody made it up, and that's about the Air America helicopter that shot down the AN-2 Colt that were trying to bomb Site 85. To this day, there's a hell of a lot of people that think, wow, that never happened. Who ever heard of a helicopter shooting down a fixed-wing aircraft? But it did in fact happen. I wasn't involved directly, but I was working about two or three valleys to the west, and we heard it all on the radio. I heard bits and pieces of it on the radio, and of course, had no idea what was going on. All I hear is that I'm going after him, he's smoking, etc., and I have no idea what actually is happening. But what happened was the bad guys sent a couple of, maybe three, of AN-2 Colts. If you're familiar with the nomenclature, the AN-2 Colt was a kind of a VSTOL aircraft, biplane, designed for short takeoffs and landings in rugged terrain, and a Russian design and Russian produced. And they sent a couple of these Colts over to Site 85. Site 85 was a TACAN as well as a radar homing and direction finder device that was very important for the Air Force guys that were going to bomb in North Vietnam. So the bad guys decided they needed to knock this thing out, and they sent these Colts over. Well, one of our guys in a Huey, a guy named Ted Moore, flying with a crew chief named Glenn Woods, they're on the ground when this happens at Site 85, resupplying Site 85. The rules were, if something like that happened, any attack on a site, you were supposed to get the customer and get the hell out of there as quickly as you could. Well, he cranks up his helicopter and takes off and realizes that the aircraft that he's looking at is probably not much more of a performance type aircraft than the Huey that he was flying. So he flies up alongside one of the AN-2s, and Woody, the crew chief, who had an AK-47, leans out the side of the helicopter and shoots him down. And there was another AN-2 that crashed also. I'm not sure that he was shot down. I think he was just trying to get away from this crazy helicopter pilot. And he flew into a mountainside. So they got two of these AN-2s. And of course, this happened around midday. And before the end of the late afternoon time, Woody and Ted Moore find themselves in the ambassador's office in Vientiane being told, you are never to say anything about this, of course, but it was ridiculous to try to keep it secret. It was on, we all heard it on the radio. And as a matter of fact, a few weeks later, when I visited my friend King in Vietnam, that time during the Tet Offensive that he mentioned, of course, this was the night before we actually realized that the Tet Offensive had begun. We're having a beer, and I said, King, something happened in Laos about 3 or 4 weeks ago that was the best happy hour story you've ever heard in your life. And King interrupts me and says, oh, you mean about the Air America chopper that shot down the MiG? By that time, the story had traveled 1,000 miles, and the aircraft had become a MiG instead of this biplane that it actually was. So like everything else, it really wasn't much of a secret at all. Characters. We had some characters. Let's talk about some of them. Tony Poe, real name Anthony Poshepny, was a CIA guy who had fought for the Marines in World War II. Somewhere along the end of World War II, early years of after World War II, he goes to work with OSS. OSS became CIA, and Tony Poe had worked in Asia ever since World War II, right up until the time that the evacuation of Laos and Saigon occurred in 1975. Might have come home for vacation, training occasionally, but he was assigned to Asia consistently the whole 20-plus years after World War II. He was an alcoholic, unapologetic alcoholic. We would spend the night with him up at his hooch. He was an extreme, his base, if you go look up there at the very top of the slide there, where Burma, China, North Vietnam, Laos, and Thailand all come together up there, that's where Tony Poe was. Laos is a remote country, and this was the most remote part of Laos that you can think of. He was kind of the warlord of all of northwestern Laos. There was a rumor once that the character that played by Robert Duvall in Apocalypse Now was supposedly modeled after Tony Poe. I don't think that that's true, but that was the kind of power that he had in that particular area. As I said, he was an alcoholic. He was also completely indispensable to what we were doing up there. He pretty much ran northwestern Laos. When we spent the night with him at his base up there in northwestern Thailand, he would expect us to drink with him at night, and nobody could drink with Tony. He drank Vat 69 Scotch and chased it with Kinman wine from the island, from little offshore islands off of the China coast. Or maybe it was the wine being chased by the Scotch, I can't remember. Whatever, we couldn't drink with him. Now, where that wine came from was interesting too, because during the 50s, before he got involved in Laos, he used to raid the Chinese coast with Chiang Kai-shek, Chiang Kai-shek's son, and Tony Poe worked together in the earliest years of the Chinese communist takeover of China. They would raid the coast, and there's a book out there called Raiders of the China Coast that talks about that. Chiang Kai-shek, who later became president of Taiwan after Chiang Kai-shek died, Chiang Kai-shek used to send him cases of this Kinman wine from these little islands just off the coast of China. And that's what Tony would drink every night. Vang Pao. Vang Pao was the senior officer of the Hmong guerrilla forces in northern Laos. Vang Pao had been fighting since he was in his mid-teen years with the French against the communists, and had risen through the ranks and had become the senior officer among all of the Hmong forces, which later on were folded into the Royal Lao Army, even though they were separate ethnically and really never got along too well with the lowland Lao. But Vang Pao was a warrior. He was also, I think, slightly corrupt by our standards. But be that as it may, he was always up front with his troops. One time he got shot while he was hanging on the side of one of our H-34s talking to the pilot. He got shot and wounded then. But that was typical about Vang Pao. He was always right there on the front line. One time I remember bringing in a load of 4.2-inch mortar ammunition to a site that Vang Pao's troops had just retaken from the enemy probably just minutes prior. They set up a 4-deuce mortar position, and I was bringing in a load of 4.2-inch mortars, and when I landed, the VP was right there helping to unload the 4-deuce mortars. They took it just a few feet away, right over to the mortar position, dropping them in the tubes, and the bad guys were still in sight at the other end of the valley. But that's the kind of warrior that VP was. I was privileged to speak at his, when he died in Fresno, California. There's a few clusters around the country of Hmong refugees. One of them is in central California, and he died and is buried in Fresno. But they had a huge, what they call a soul release ceremony for him in St. Paul, Minnesota, which is another cluster of Hmong refugees, northern Wisconsin and around Minneapolis and St. Paul. And I was privileged to speak at this soul release ceremony for BP because, as I said, despite whatever flaws he may have had, he was one hell of a warrior. Father Lucien Bouchard, a French-Canadian name. He was actually from New Hampshire. Father Bouchard was one of the most fearless men that I think I've ever known. He had been working for 18 years in those hills in Laos, ministering to the Hmong. And whenever we were available, we would take him to wherever he needed to go. But if he wasn't available, he walked. He walked through minefields. He climbed those mountains. He was in incredible physical condition. No regard for the enemy. And he was there right up until the time the Pathet Lao took over and ran him out of there. Like I said, 18 years doing this in Laos. And then from Laos, he went over to New Guinea and did the same thing in the jungles of New Guinea for another 20 plus years. He's now retired, lives in a home for retired priests in somewhere outside of Boston. Before he retired, he had a small parish, a dirt poor parish in a suburb of Miami, which is where there are a cluster of Haitian immigrants, and he was the priest at this parish. They met at a very, very humble, run-down former school gymnasium. I took him to dinner, and then not long after that, he retired and moved into this home for retired priests. Some of our pilots, probably the most legendary of our pilots, was a guy named Jim Rhine, R-H-Y-N-E. If you've ever been to the Georgia Aviation Hall of Fame down in Warner Robins, Rhine is enshrined down there posthumously. He had already died. He was a legend. He was flying for us, but we always thought that he wasn't really an Air America pilot. He was actually working for CIA the whole time. And sure enough, after we left over there, he was doing things that validated that suspicion that we had. He lost his leg flying a mission in northern Laos. Came back, by that time I had already come back home, and he was rehabilitating at the Emory Hospital. I went to visit him at Emory Hospital. He went back over there, continued to fly until we left Southeast Asia. A little while after that, he turns out to have been the guy several months before the abortive Iranian rescue mission. Remember that, Desert One, during the Carter administration, during the last year of the Carter administration? He was the guy that flew a Twin Beach, a King Air I think it was, into Desert One several months prior to make sure that it was in fact usable for C-130s and helicopters. The plausible deniability part was that he was just a civilian pilot that got lost. So he got in and out of there, dodged the Iranian radar, and got out of there and was the guy that came back and said, yes, Desert One is suitable for C-130s and helicopters. And then after that, he winds up flying logistical support for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. Another book, a novel, quote unquote, called The Black Tulip. The Black Tulip, as I said, is a novel, but it was written by the CIA station chief in Pakistan at the time that we were supporting the Mujahideen with Stinger missiles. And sure enough, the logistical support for our guys in Afghanistan that were supporting the Mujahideen and the Stinger missile program was one of the pilots that was supporting them was in fact Jim Ryan, and he's mentioned in this novel. It's obvious who it is. It's Jim with another last name, and he's got a wooden leg which he lost in Laos, and he wore a gold bracelet and a gold Rolex, etc., etc. It's obvious that it was Jim Ryan. Charlie Whites, another one of our characters, helicopter pilot. Charlie Whites, when he got his time off, he would go to Hong Kong. He had a favorite concierge at the Hong Kong Hilton. And he would check in, he'd call up the concierge and say, he'd fly there into Hong Kong with nothing but the shirt on his back. And he'd call up the concierge and say, send me everything you've got. Send me clothes, send me women, send me food, send me booze. And he did that each time he went to Hong Kong. Now, I said, Charlie, and we'd all say, well, Charlie, what are you going to do with all these clothes? Because there's no need to wear them, anywhere else. And he'd box them up every few months and send them back to the States. Another character, Clarence Driver. Clarence Driver had been one of the original Tuskegee Airmen in World War II. Later became Ray Charles' personal pilot, and then wound up flying for Air America when I was there. Lloyd Zimmerman. Zimmerman was, I'll tell one story about Zim that kind of illustrates the way he was. He was flying a Pilatus Porter, a STOL aircraft, and I was on the ground at a site about halfway between a town called Saravan. Can we back up one slide? Okay, it does show down there. Toward the bottom of the map, you'll see it says Saravan, in the middle of Laos. The Ho Chi Minh Trail obviously ran over to the east of there, and we had a little strip that was about halfway between Saravan and the trail. And I was sitting there one day waiting to do something on the trail, and Zim comes back in his Pilatus Porter, and he's got a bullet hole, an entrance hole in the top of the wing. Out the bottom of the wing, into the fuselage, and out the bottom left side of the fuselage. And I said, Zim, how do you get a hole like that? Were you doing a loop? And he said, no, I was just down on the Sedone River doing a river recon for the customer. And I said, well, how high were you? And he said, well, 2 or 3 feet. Bad guy on the riverbank shot down at him, put a bullet hole in his wing, but he brought it back. I rode back with Zim one time. I deadheaded back. I was supposed to just leave the aircraft, turn it over to another guy, and I'm deadheading back, just riding back to Udorn with Zim in his Porter, and the Mekong was down. We were following the Mekong. The Mekong was low, and he says, hey, you want to shoot some touch and goes on that sandbar down there? I said, no. He said, oh, come on. I said, Zim, it's your aircraft. If you want to do that, fine, go ahead. So we shoot touch and goes on the sandbar and survived. Phil Goddard. Phil Goddard is another sort of SAR that I got involved in. Phil Goddard was one of our pilots who was flying a Huey and came overhead when I was working at a place called Nambak, another valley up there just east of, across the Lao border from Dien Bien Phu. And Phil Goddard comes overhead, and he's flying even further north. And he says he's going into a pad that he's unfamiliar with, way the hell up near the Chinese border. And he's unfamiliar with it and unsure about it, and could I go to altitude and sort of act as a radio relay in case something happened. So I did, thinking that all I'm going to do for a few minutes is just bore holes in the sky. And sure enough, Phil calls it, he says he's going into the LZ, and a few minutes later he says, I'm hit. And that's all I heard. Nothing after that. So I made a broadcast in the blind of telling whoever was listening where I was and where he was, and that I was heading up there to get him. So I head north with no idea what I was going to find up there. You know, for all I knew, all I was going to find was a smoking hole in the ground, right? But luckily, as I'm heading up there, here comes Phil in the other direction. He had been shot, and he's not talking on the radio. Crew chief is doing the talking, and I said, who's flying the aircraft? Well, Phil was flying, but he'd been hit in the head. His lip mic was shattered, and he couldn't talk. Turned out to be, it was very, very bloody. As you know, you get a head wound, and even if it's not serious, it's going to bleed a hell of a lot. And luckily for him, it just sort of skimmed his scalp. Very, very bloody, but I chased him back to the nearest friendly airstrip, and he was okay much later. I went back to see him. He was now the other interesting thing about Phil was not only this incident, but he wasn't American. He had become a citizen, but he was from Barbados. A long-time, centuries-old family from Barbados. Went down to Barbados to visit him, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago. His family had never heard this story. They knew he had gotten wounded, his kids, they didn't know the details. Phil was a kind of a soft-spoken kind of guy. He never talked to them. Only one of his kids was an infant at the time. The remainder of his kids had been born subsequently. They were all grown now. And none of them had ever heard the story, so I took all my old maps down there and spread them out on his dining room table and told the story, which, of course, they were amazed. They didn't know that their dad had ever done anything like that. Casualties. That always comes up. And oh, by the way, most of us had a personal weapon. I had a folding stock AK that I liberated off of a stack of captured weapons. I kept it for a few months and gave it away. Most guys had some form of personal weaponry, but you weren't supposed to have it in Laos. We were supposed to be unarmed. It was a good idea to have a weapon, I think. From the beginning of Dien Bien Phu, of those first two casualties I mentioned at Dien Bien Phu, in 1954, through the evacuation of Saigon in 75, Air America and Civil Air Transport had 243 KIAs. There were a few MIAs too that I'm really not sure how they were accounted for ultimately. During the time that I was there, in the 20 months from January of 67 until August of 68, we lost 4 guys, as I recall. Lost a lot of aircraft. We operated, in my particular program, the H-34 program, we operated the equivalent of about a helicopter squadron, about 24 aircraft at a time. And while I was there, we lost 12. 6 to enemy action and 6 to accidents. As I mentioned, the very rugged terrain and the weather would take its toll. However, these aircraft were very quickly replaced or repaired. We had an unbelievable maintenance facility back at Udorn. You'd bring in an aircraft overnight with a half a dozen gripes. If you had it up country for about a week, and you'd come back and you'd have maybe a half a dozen gripes on the aircraft that would normally keep the aircraft on the ground, and then any number of other less important discrepancies with the aircraft. And they'd fix that thing overnight and send it back out the next morning. They worked around the clock. It seemed to me like there was, one coolie per rivet working on these aircraft. Did an incredible job quantity-wise, and I thought the quality of the maintenance was pretty good also. I'm available to answer any more questions. I probably skipped a few things here that you might be interested in, but I can't finish up without talking a little bit about that god-awful Mel Gibson movie. There's a handout on each of your tables. I think there's at least one for everybody there you're welcome to take that with you if you want. That movie was worse than a bad movie. It was a slander. The underlying plot of the movie was that the reason why Air America existed was to smuggle drugs for the CIA. That's like saying that we fought the Nazis because we wanted the Mercedes franchise. It's absolute nonsense. Did we have guys that in fact did hard time for smuggling drugs? Yes, we did. Guess what? So has Delta Airlines. But that doesn't mean that that's why we were there. It made it look realistic. The movie did look realistic. It was filmed in northern Thailand with terrain almost as rugged as Laos. The aircraft looked realistic. They hung out in a place called the White Rose. It was kind of a bar slash bordello in one of the upcountry towns, and in fact there was a place named the White Rose where we hung out. But the drug smuggling story was just false, and it's described in detail in that handout. The only realistic thing about that movie was the uncanny resemblance between myself and Mel Gibson. But other than that, it was BS. There are a lot of references. I'll close with just a couple of other references that you can look up if you're interested in hearing more about this. Professor at the University of Georgia named Bill Leary wrote a book called Perilous Missions, which is about CIA air operations from the end of World War II until 1960. And when he passed away a few years ago, he was writing the history of CIA air ops from 1960 on until 75. He never finished that book, but those archives are his notes and his manuscripts are in our archives at the University of Texas, Dallas. I mentioned Raiders of the China Coast. A guy that spoke to this group here, Phil Jennings, who became my best friend over there, he wrote a book called A Politically Incorrect Guide to the Vietnam War, and also 2 novels about those days. I made a presentation at the Library of Congress not long ago about all of this, along with a Special Forces guy and a CIA guy and some of the Lao Army people. I made that presentation that many of us have with the Atlanta History Center. You can look that up. Joe Galloway and I did a Witness to War interview one time. You can find that. And other than that, you're welcome to take those handouts with you if you want. And I'll answer any questions if we have time for questions. I don't know. Yeah. Thank you, sir. Yeah, got it. Yeah. Any questions?
Yeah, thank you, sir. Really appreciate you being here. Did you all interface with the Ravens? I was a bird dog guy.
Say that again, I'm sorry?
The Ravens.
Oh, yeah. The Ravens arrived during the time that I was there, and I don't recall ever working directly with the Ravens, but boy, they had some characters too. Those guys were what they call sheep dip. We were civilians. Those guys, which of course I say we were civilians, and of course it's been acknowledged since then that we were actually CIA employees, or government employees I should say. But the Ravens actually never left the Air Force. They took off their uniforms and left their IDs behind, but they were actually still in the Air Force when they were doing what they did. And there's another book out there called The Ravens, which is pretty good about that. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I don't have a question. I have an attaboy for you guys. A lot of people don't know this, but from August 64 to December of 66, LBJ and McNamara would not allow Air Force or Navy helicopters into North Vietnam. I flew on 17 hot ResCaps during that time, and all the helicopters were Air America.
Yeah.
And they did a great job, but there was one problem. It took them about 2 hours to get there.
Yeah.
And we usually lost a guy in 2 hours. But if they got there an hour and a half, we got them out.
Yeah. Like I said, we were all very highly experienced, knew the area very well, and maybe most important of all, we were already up there positioned in northern Laos when these things happened in North Vietnam.
Yeah, General, can you talk about the lethality of the Pathet Lao, how bad they were?
Well, the Pathet Lao, Vang Pao's troops, when they were properly led by guys like Vang Pao, could handle the Pathet Lao. The Royal Lao Army, I hope I don't offend anybody by saying this, there were a lot of warriors with the Royal Lao Army, but the leadership of the Royal Lao Army really preferred not to fight. The lowland Lao and the Hmong in the mountains really didn't care much for each other. They work together and they have joint reunion groups here in the States now among the refugees. But back in those days, they were pretty much a separate group. The lowland Lao regarded the Hmong as second-class citizens, more primitive, which they were. But the Hmong would fight. The Hmong would fight when they were properly led and fight well with guys like Vang Pao as their leaders. The Pathet Lao they'd run if they got assaulted the way that we did sometimes. Yeah.
Any other questions? I guess that's it.
Anything else? Okay.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. My pleasure. Oh, great.
Larry, 1 second. You mentioned, when you started your talk, you mentioned that the incentive for your getting involved in Air America was Norm Grammer.
Oh, yeah. One other thing. Yeah, let me mention
What
one more
happened to
thing.
Norm Grammer? You might share that. He was a friend of mine.
Yeah. It's kind of ironic, really. Norm Grammer, I got there before Norm Grammer, even though he was the guy that kind of planted the seed in my head to go to work for Air America. He didn't show up until about a year after I got there. And then, about a year after that, Norm Grammer got shot down and killed, along with Glenn Woods, who I mentioned earlier was the trigger man at the shoot down at Site 85 when they shot down the AN-2 Colt when it was attacking Site 85. So Woody never survived to tell the story, but Ted Moore, who was the pilot of that Huey, involved in the shoot down, he still shows up at our reunions every now and then. And I'm not so sure Ted Moore has ever done an interview or anything like that. I've never been able to find one about those days, but Ted's still around.
Well, thank you.
Okay.